The private intensive care wing of St. Helena Medical Center was quieter than the rest of the hospital. Not the ordinary quiet of late-night hospital corridors, but the controlled silence of a place where powerful people waited for answers medicine could not always give. Soft white lights reflected off polished floors. Monitors hummed in steady rhythm. Every sound felt careful measured. And outside one particular ICU room, 2 uniformed Marine guards stood perfectly still. Inside that room lay the reason. An 18-year-old boy rested motionless in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that breathed for him. A ventilator rose and fell beside his chest. That. Each sound marked the fragile rhythm of the body that had refused to wake for 6 months. The boy wore a bright red shirt and simple white pants, an unusual sight against sterile hospital sheets. The hospital staff had tried to change them weeks ago, but the boy's father had refused. He always liked red, the Marine general had said quietly. So the boy still wore red. General Marcus Hale stood beside the bed now, his large hands resting lightly on the rail. Even in civilian clothes, he carried the posture of a man who had commanded thousands of Marines. Broad shoulders, straight spine, a presence that made people instinctively lower their voices. But inside this room, Marcus Hale was not a general. He was simply a father watching machines keep his son alive. 6 months earlier, a car crash outside San Diego had nearly taken the boy's life. Brake failure on a winding mountain road. The impact had been devastating. Severe traumatic brain injury. Multiple neurological shutdowns. And after weeks of testing, scans, and consultations, the hospital had reached a conclusion they had delivered carefully but firmly. Brain death. No response. No awareness. No recovery. The machines were simply delaying the inevitable. Across the room, quietly adjusting in Roman 4 line, stood the newest nurse assigned to the ICU floor. Her name was Mac Carter. Most of the staff still referred to her simply as the rookie. She had arrived at St. Helena only 3 weeks earlier. Her resume looked ordinary. Former field nurse. Several years working overseas with humanitarian organizations. No prestigious academic hospital experience. No research background. To the senior physicians, she was simply another young nurse still learning the ropes. But there was something about Emma that made people occasionally pause when they watched her work. She moved differently. Not rush. Not uncertain. Just calm. When monitors alarmed, she did not panic. When emergencies broke out, she did not shout. She simply appeared where she was needed and handled things with quiet efficiency. Tonight, as she adjusted the Roman 4 beside the unconscious boy, her eyes drifted briefly toward the monitor displaying his neurological signals. Flat. Just as they had been for months. Yet something about the readings made her linger. A faint irregularity beneath the steady pattern. Barely noticeable. The kind of thing most staff had stopped looking for weeks ago. The ICU door opened softly. 2 physicians stepped inside. The lead neurologist, Dr. Bennett, carried a tablet in his hand. His expression held the familiar weight of a conversation he had already rehearsed. He approached the Marine general slowly. "General Hale," he said respectfully. The general nodded but did not take his eyes off his son. "Doctor," Bennett glanced at the monitor before continuing. "We've repeated every neurological test available." His voice was calm. Clinical. But the meaning behind his words was heavy. The brain shows no activity. The ventilator continued its steady rhythm beside the bed. Bip, bip, bip. Doctor, Bennett took a slow breath. At this point, continuing life support is no longer medically meaningful. The words hung in the air. Emma's hands paused briefly over the Roman 4 pump. The general finally turned his head. His face remained calm, but his eyes held the quiet tension of a man standing on the edge of something irreversible. "Doctor," Bennett continued gently, "we believe it may be time to consider removing the ventilator." Silence filled the room. The machines kept breathing for the boy. But everyone present knew the truth. Once that machine stopped, the boy's heart would follow soon after. The general returned his gaze to his son. 6 months of grief had hardened him into quiet stillness. Yet he did not answer immediately. Across the room, Emma looked again at the neurological monitor. That faint irregularity appeared again. A tiny shift in the pattern, so small it could easily be dismissed as electrical noise. But something in her instincts stirred. She stepped closer to the bed. Her fingers gently checked the boy's wrist pulse. Still present. Still steady. Doctor, Bennett continued, speaking softly to the general. We will give you time to say goodbye. The ventilator hissed again. The boy's chest rose and fell mechanically. Emma's eyes moved between the monitor and the patient's face. Something didn't match. Something about the rhythm felt wrong. Like a pattern that had been misread. She hesitated. Interrupting a conversation between a lead physician and a patient's family was not something rookie nurses did. But finally she spoke. Sir. Her voice was quiet but steady. Both men looked at her. Doctor, Bennett frowned slightly. Emma glanced at the monitor again. Then at the boy. Then back to the Marine general. You might want to wait. The doctor's eyebrows narrowed. Nurse, doctor, Bennett said calmly, this patient has shown no neurological response for 6 months. Emma didn't argue. She stepped closer to the bed instead. Her eyes fixed on the monitor. Then on the boy's face. Everyone expected nothing. That's what had happened every day for half a year. Nothing. The ventilator beeped again. The machines continued their mechanical rhythm. And then, something impossible happened. A single tear slowly formed at the corner of the boy's closed eye. At first it was so small no one was certain they had seen it. But then it rolled slowly down his cheek. And the entire room went silent. Doctor, Bennett froze. The Marine generals had snapped toward his son's face. The tear continued downward across the boy's temple before disappearing into the pillow. The monitor beside the bed flickered. A faint neurological signal pulsed across the screen. The doctor stared. That shouldn't be there. Across the room, Emma's calm expression never changed. But inside her mind, a single thought had already formed. The fight inside that boy's brain might not be over. And if she was right, everything the hospital believed about this patient was about to collapse. The tear on the boy's cheek should not have been possible. For 6 months, every neurological test had shown the same conclusion. No brain response. No awareness. No activity. Yet the tear had fallen. And the monitor beside the bed had just displayed something the doctors had not seen since the night of the accident. A pulse. Not strong. Not stable. But unmistakably real. Inside the ICU room, the silence became heavy. Doctor, Bennett stared at the screen as if it had suddenly begun speaking a language he no longer understood. That shouldn't be there, he repeated under his breath. The Marine general did not look at the monitor. His eyes were locked on his son's face. Years of battlefield experience had trained him to notice the smallest changes. And the tear he had just seen was not a hallucination. It was real. Emma stepped closer to the monitor. Her movements remained calm, controlled. But her attention sharpened. The signal flickered again. Weak electrical activity moved across the EEG line before fading. The neurologist grabbed a penlight and leaned toward the boy's eyes. He lifted one eyelid carefully and shone the beam across the pupil. Pupil response minimal, he muttered. He repeated the test. This time, the pupil reacted slightly faster. Doctor, Bennett stepped back slowly. This could be an involuntary reflex, he said. But his voice carried none of the certainty it had only minutes earlier. The monitor beeped again. Another small wave appeared. Emma pointed quietly toward the screen. Look at the pattern. The neurologist followed her finger. The waveform wasn't random. It repeated. Small but organized. The Marine general turned his attention toward the monitor now. What does that mean? He asked. Doctor, Bennett hesitated. It was a moment doctors disliked. A moment where their answers became uncertain. It means, he said carefully, there may be some neurological activity. 6 months of medical certainty collapsed in that single sentence. Emma studied the patient's breathing. The ventilator pushed air steadily into the boy's lungs. But the rhythm between breaths felt different now. Almost like the body was trying to assist. trying to fight. She leaned closer to the bed. Her eyes studied the boy's face, then his hands, then the monitor again. Something about the pattern looked familiar. Not from textbooks. From somewhere else. Somewhere harsher. Somewhere far from quiet hospital rooms. Doctor, then it turned toward the door and reached for the emergency phone. I need the neuro team in ICU 4 immediately, he said. Within seconds, the peaceful hallway outside the room began to stir. Footsteps echoed. Doors opened. Voices rose quietly as more medical staff rushed toward the room. Inside, the Marine general still stood beside the bed. He placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder. The boy did not move, but the general did not pull his hand away. He simply waited. More doctors entered moments later. 2 senior neurologists, a resident, a technician pushing a portable EEG scanner. Wires were attached carefully across the boy's scalp. The equipment hummed as it powered up. The screen expanded into a grid of neural readings. Lines flickered. Most were still flat, but several showed faint movement. The senior neurologist leaned forward. Run full EEG channels. The technician nodded. Within seconds, the screen filled with data. The room watched in silence. One of the neurologists leaned closer to the display. Then his eyebrows lifted. This pattern, he murmured. The resident stepped beside him. What about it? The neurologist pointed to the repeating wave. It's not random. He zoomed in. The pulses appeared again. What? But structure. Something is responding to stimuli, he said. That's impossible, the resident replied. If the brainstem were functioning at that level, we would have seen it months ago. The neurologist shook his head slowly. Unless the brain deliberately suppressed activity. The room grew quiet. Across the bed, Emma watched the monitor carefully. Her instincts whispered something she could not yet fully explain. The Marine general spoke. Explain it. The neurologist turned to him. Sometimes, under extreme trauma, the brain enters a protective shutdown. The general said nothing. The neurologist continued. It's extremely rare, but the brain can suppress most neurological functions to survive severe damage. The resident frowned. But 6 months? The neurologist shook his head slowly. I've never seen it last that long. The Marine general turned toward Emma. She had been the first to question the diagnosis. How did you know something was wrong? He asked. Emma hesitated. Her eyes remained on the monitor. I didn't know, she said quietly. I just noticed the pattern. Doctor, Bennett looked at her carefully now. You recognized this before? Emma took a slow breath. Yes? Where? For a moment, she said nothing. Then she answered. Afghanistan. The room went still. The word changed everything. The neurologist frowned slightly. You served in the military? Emma shook her head. Not officially. The Marine general studied her now with a new kind of attention. He had spent decades evaluating soldiers, and the calm confidence in her voice was not something civilian hospitals produce. What did you see there? He asked. Emma glanced at the patient. During an extraction mission, one of our Marines took a severe head injury. Her voice remained steady. No brain activity for nearly 15 minutes. The neurologist blinked. Guilty? Emma nodded. Everyone thought he was gone. The room listened carefully. Our unit's combat medic used a recall technique. Doctor, Bennett tilted his head. What kind of technique? Emma hesitated. Verbal command patterns combined with nerve stimulation. The neurologist frowned. That's not recognized medical protocol. No, Emma said calmly. It's battlefield protocol. The Marine general's eyes narrowed slightly. Did it work? Emma looked back at the boy lying in the bed. Yes. Silence filled the room again. The neurologist crossed his arms. You're suggesting something similar might be happening here? Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the monitor. The faint neurological waves appeared again. Then again. Then she looked toward the Marine general. There may be a way to test it. Doctor, Bennett immediately shook his head. There is no medically accepted procedure for that. But the Marine general didn't look at the doctor. He looked at Emma. What would you do? Emma stepped closer to the head of the bed. Her fingers gently touched a point along the side of the boy's neck. A nerve cluster beneath the skin. One combat medics sometimes used. I'd try to bring him back. The neurologist shook his head again. That's dangerous. Emma met his eyes calmly. So is giving up. The room went silent. The Marine general studied her carefully. Then, slowly, he nodded. And the moment that followed would soon shake the entire hospital. Because the quiet rookie nurse was about to break every protocol in the room. An attempt at battlefield technique no doctor there had ever seen. The room had gone so quiet that the ventilator's mechanical breathing sounded louder than before. Every doctor present understood something unusual was about to happen. And none of them were comfortable with it. Dr. Bennett stepped forward immediately. General, with respect, he said carefully, we cannot allow unapproved procedures. His voice was controlled, but the tension underneath was obvious. This patient has been declared brain dead. Any stimulation techniques could destabilize what little remains. But the Marine general did not move. His gaze stayed on Emma. Will it harm him? He asked. Emma answered without hesitation. No. The neurologist frowned. You cannot guarantee that. Emma turned slightly toward him. No one in this room can guarantee anything. The doctor opened his mouth to argue again. But the Marine general raised one hand. That single gesture ended the debate. Do it. The order was quiet, but unmistakable. Years of command authority filled the room with that one word. Dr. Bennett looked frustrated but stepped back. If something goes wrong, he warned, the hospital will have no choice but to intervene. And Matt didn't respond. She had already stepped beside the patient. The boy lay motionless, the ventilator breathing for him in slow mechanical cycles. 6 months of stillness. 6 months of silence. Emma leaned closer to his head. Her fingers moved gently along the side of his neck until she found the nerve point she was searching for. Her touch was precise. Practice. Not the movement of a nurse guessing. The movement of someone who had done this before. Across the room, the neurologists watched with cautious curiosity. The Marine general remained beside the bed, his large hand resting lightly on the rail. He said nothing. But every muscle in his body carried the tension of a soldier waiting for the outcome of a dangerous operation. Emma leaned close to the boy's ear. Her voice dropped into a quiet but firm tone. It was not the soft voice nurses usually used with patients. It carried something sharper. Something unmistakably military. Listen carefully, she said. If you can hear me, you need to fight your way back. The doctors exchanged uncertain looks. But Emma continued. Her fingers applied gentle pressure to the nerve cluster along the boy's neck. Then she spoke again. This time the words carried the rhythm of a battlefield command. 4 simple words. Sure. Cow. Recognizable to anyone who had served in combat. Marine returned to command. Nothing happened. The ventilator hissed again. The monitor beeped steadily. Flat lines continued across the neurological screen. Dr. Bennett folded his arms. This is exactly why protocols exist, he muttered quietly. But Emma did not move. Her fingers adjusted slightly, pressing another nerve point. She leaned closer. Her voice became firmer. Marine returned to command. The room waited. Seconds passed. 5. Still nothing. The neurologist glanced at the monitor. Then something changed. One of the EEG lines flickered. Just briefly. But this time it was stronger than before. Dr. Bennett leaned forward. What? The line flickered again. Then another. Across the screen, faint electrical signals began appearing in multiple channels. The technician stared at the monitor. Signal amplitude increasing, he whispered. The resident leaned closer. That's impossible. But the screen did not care what they believed. The signals continued growing stronger. Emma's fingers applied slightly more pressure to the nerve cluster. Then she spoke the command again. Marine returned to command. The ventilator beeped. And suddenly, the boy's eyelids twitched. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but everyone in the room saw it. Dr. Bennett took an involuntary step closer. Did he just? The boy's fingers moved. Just slightly, but unmistakably. The Marine general froze. His hand gripped the bed rail. For 6 months, his son's body had not moved at all. Now the fingers twitched again. The neurologist stared at the monitor. The EEG line surged with activity. Voluntary motor response, the technician said, his voice shaking. That's voluntary movement. The Marine general leaned closer to his son. Oh! The boy's eyelids fluttered again. The ventilator continued pushing air into his lungs. But suddenly, his chest lifted. Not entirely from the machine. A small breath. A weak, fragile breath. But it came from the boy himself. The neurologist's eyes widened. He is initiating respiration. The resident looked stunned. That's not possible. But the monitor confirmed it. Another breath. Then another. Wait! Unreal! The room had shifted from disbelief to controlled chaos. Doctors rushed to adjust the ventilator settings. Nurses repositioned monitoring equipment. The neurologist spoke quickly. Reduce ventilator assistance, slowly. The technician adjusted the controls. The machine eased back slightly. Everyone watch. 10 seconds pass. The boy took another breath. On his own. The Marine general closed his eyes for a moment. Not from grief. From something else. Relief. Emma stepped back quietly. Our work was done. The doctors now surrounded the bed, adjusting machines and recording data. But several of them kept glancing toward her. The rookie nurse who had just done something they had declared impossible. The Marine general turned toward her. His expression carried something deeper than gratitude. Respect. You reminded him how to fight, he said quietly. Emma shook her head. He did that himself. The neurologist finally looked at her directly. How did you know that would work? Emma didn't answer immediately. She simply watched the patient breathing slowly on his own. Then she spoke. I've seen soldiers come back from worse. But the miracle unfolding in that ICU room was about to trigger consequences no one there expected. Because breaking hospital protocol, especially in a case declared brain dead, was not something administrators ignored. And within minutes, Emma would learn that saving a life did not protect her from punishment. The ICU no longer felt like the quiet wing it had been earlier that evening. Doctors moved quickly around the bed. Nurses checked monitors. The neurologists watched the EEG readings with intense focus as the boy's brain activity continued to strengthen. What had been declared impossible only an hour earlier was now unfolding in front of them. The Marine general's son was breathing. Wait. Slowly. But breathing on his own. The ventilator settings were lowered again. The boy's chest rose and fell with greater effort. Each breath looked like a small battle being won. The neurologist studied the monitor. Respiratory function improving, he said. The resident shook his head in disbelief. 6 months. The senior neurologist nodded slowly. And now voluntary neurological responses. Across the room, Emma stood quietly near the Roman IV stand. She did not speak. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the patient. Her expression remained calm, almost distant. The same quiet focus she had shown since the beginning. To her, the moment looked familiar. She had seen soldiers stabilize like this before. Slowly returning from the edge. The Marine general stepped closer to the bed. His large hand gently wrapped around his son's. Son, he whispered. You're safe. The boy's fingers twitched again beneath his father's hand. A small movement, but enough to make the room fall silent again. Dr. Bennett exhaled slowly. I don't understand how we missed this. One of the neurologists replied quietly. Because no one was looking anymore. The words hung in the air. 6 months of tests. 6 months of charts. 6 months of medical certainty. And yet it had taken the hospital's newest nurse to question it. But the moment of triumph did not last long. The ICU door opened sharply. Two hospital administrators entered the room. Behind them came the hospital director, Dr. Alan Whitaker. His expression was tight, controlled, but clearly irritated. "What is happening here?" he demanded. The neurologists turned toward him. Dr. Bennett spoke first. "The patient is showing neurological recovery." Whitaker frowned. "That patient was declared brain dead." "Not anymore," the neurologist replied. Whitaker stepped toward the monitors. His eyes scanned the readings. The evidence was clear. Brain activity, breathing, motor response. The impossible had happened. But instead of relief, the director's expression darkened. "Who authorized experimental procedures on this patient?" Silence filled the room. Dr. Bennett hesitated. Then he glanced toward Matt. The director followed his gaze. His eyes landed on her immediately. "The nurse." Whitaker's voice sharpened. "You performed an unauthorized procedure?" Matt answered calmly. "Yes." The room shifted again. The Marine general turned toward the director. "She saved my son." Whitaker did not look impressed. "That does not excuse violating hospital protocol." His voice grew colder. "This hospital operates under strict medical regulations." He looked directly at Matt. "You interfered with an end-of-life case." The neurologist stepped forward. "Director, her actions triggered neurological activity we had not detected." Whitaker turned toward him. "That does not matter." He pointed toward the monitor. "Medical miracles do not override legal liability." The Marine general's expression hardened. "My son is breathing because of her." Whitaker answered calmly. "And if the patient had died during her intervention?" The question hung in the air. Matt said nothing. Whitaker looked back at her. "You placed this hospital at serious legal risk." The Marine general took a step forward. "She acted because your doctors gave up." Whitaker's voice remained controlled. "That decision was made based on medical evidence." He looked again at Matt. "Which you chose to ignore." The room grew tense. Doctors exchanged uncomfortable looks. No one wanted to argue with hospital administration. But the reality was standing right in front of them. The patient was alive. Still, Whitaker continued. "Nurse Emma Carter," he said firmly, "you are being removed from this case immediately." The words hit the room like a cold wind. The Marine general turned sharply. "That's ridiculous." Whitaker didn't respond to him. Instead, he spoke to the charge nurse. "Escort her off the ICU floor." The charge nurse hesitated. "Oh, that is not a request," Whitaker interrupted. Two security officers appeared at the doorway moments later. They approached Matt. The entire ICU watched. The woman who had just saved a life was being removed like a liability. The Marine general spoke again. "This is a mistake." Whitaker replied calmly. "General, hospital policy must be enforced." Matt quietly removed her gloves. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once. "I understand." She stepped away from the bed. Before leaving, she glanced once more at the boy. His breathing had stabilized. His brain activity continued rising. The fight inside him was working. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Security followed beside her. Doctors stood silently as she passed. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked ashamed. But no one stopped the director. Emma reached the hallway outside the ICU. The Marine guard outside the room watched her walk past. Inside the ICU, the miracle continued unfolding. But the person responsible for it was no longer allowed to be there. And within the hour, something else would arrive at St. Helena Medical Center. Something far more powerful than hospital administration. Black vehicles, military escorts, and a man whose authority would make the hospital director regret every decision he had just made. Because Emma Carter was not the rookie nurse they believed she was. And very soon, the truth about her past was about to arrive. The ICU wing slowly settled back into its tense rhythm after Amal was escorted out. Doctors returned to the bedside. Machines continued monitoring the Marine General's son. But the atmosphere inside the room had changed. The impossible had happened. And everyone knew who had made it happen. Yet the nurse responsible for it was no longer there. Doctor, Bennett glanced toward the door where Ma had disappeared down the hallway. Then back toward the patient. The boy's breathing had stabilized further. Each breath now came mostly from his own lungs, with the ventilator assisting only slightly. The EEG monitor showed steady activity. Weak, but organized. Life had returned. The Marine General still stood beside the bed. His large hand rested over his son's. The boy's fingers twitched again. A small movement. But it was enough. The general looked toward Dr. Bennett. She knew what she was doing. The neurologist nodded slowly. Yes, he did. Across the room, hospital director Dr. Whitaker reviewed the monitors with a tight expression. He clearly understood what had happened. But instead of relief, the director looked irritated. Because the recovery had happened outside his control. And administrators disliked losing control. The door opened again. This time, a security guard entered quickly. Director Whitaker, he said quietly. There's a situation outside. Whitaker frowned. What kind of situation? The guard hesitated. Military vehicles. The room went silent. The Marine General slowly looked up. What kind of vehicles? The guard swallowed. Several black SUVs. And 2 armored transports. Everyone in the room turned toward the hallway. Whitaker looked annoyed. This is a hospital, not a military base. But even as he spoke, a distant sound of engines echoed outside the building. Moments later, footsteps approached quickly down the corridor. The ICU doors opened again, and 4 armed military personnel stepped inside. They wore naval tactical uniforms. The patches on their shoulders were unmistakable. United States Navy, Special Warfare Command. Navy SEAL. The room went completely still. Dr. Whitaker stepped forward immediately. You cannot enter this area without authorization. The lead officer removed his sunglasses calmly. His voice carried quiet authority. We're not here for permission. The Marine General recognized the insignia immediately. His eyes narrowed. What's going on? The officer stepped closer. General Hale. The general straightened. Yes? We received a priority alert regarding your son. Whitaker interrupted. This is a private hospital case. The officer ignored him. Instead, he looked toward the monitors beside the bed. His eyes scanned the neurological readings. Then he nodded slightly. He is alive. Dr. Bennett stepped forward. Yes? The officer looked around the room. Where is she? The doctors exchanged confused glances. Oh, the neurologist asked. The nurse. Silent. Whitaker answered sharply. She was removed from this case. The officer's expression changed. You removed her. Whitaker crossed his arms. She violated hospital protocol. The officer stared at him for a moment. Then he turned toward one of the SEAL behind him. Find her. The 2 SEAL immediately left the room. Whitaker's voice rose. You cannot conduct operations inside this hospital. The officer finally looked directly at him. Director, do you know who that nurse is? Whitaker answered coldly. She is an employee who disobeyed medical orders. The officer shook his head slowly. Oh? He glanced at the Marine General. Sir, with respect, your son is alive because of her. The general nodded once. I know. The officer looked back at Whitaker. That nurse is the reason this entire response team is here. Whitaker frowned. What are you talking about? The officer stepped closer. His voice lowered. 3 years ago, a Tier 1 Special Operations unit was trapped during a classified extraction mission in Afghanistan. The room grew quiet. 14 operators were critically wounded. Evacuation impossible. Enemy forces closing in. Dr. Bennett listened carefully now. The officer continued. Only 1 medic survived the initial attack. He paused. And that medic kept 12 of those men alive for 6 hours under constant fire. Whitaker looked unimpressed. What does that have to do with this hospital? The officer's voice sharpened slightly. That medic's main. He paused. Was it Matt Carter? The room froze. Doctor, Bennett slowly turned his head. You're saying our rookie nurse? The officer nodded. Was a Tier 1 combat medic. The Marine general's eyes widened slightly. Whitaker shook his head. That's impossible, her records show. Civilian humanitarian work, the officer interrupted. Yes? Because everything else in her service file is classified. The words dropped heavily into the room. The officer continued calmly. She's been attached to Joint Special Operations units for years. Multiple deployments. Dozens of combat saves. The neurologist stared at the door where Emma had left. That explains the technique. Whitaker looked stunned. You're telling me the nurse I just removed is one of the most decorated combat medics in Special Operations history. Silence. And at that exact moment, the ICU doors opened again. 2 Navy SEAL returned, standing behind them in the hallway. Well, Emma, still calm, still quiet, as if none of this attention meant anything to her. But the moment the SEAL officer saw her, he stood perfectly straight and did something that made the entire hospital staff freeze. He saluted her. The ICU room fell completely silent. The sharp motion of the Navy SEAL officer's salute seemed to freeze the air itself. Doctors stood still. Nurses stared. Even the hospital director stopped speaking. Because the man saluting Matt Carter was not a junior officer. His insignia made that very clear. He was a SEAL commander. And yet he stood at attention in the middle of the hospital corridor saluting a nurse who had just been escorted out by security. Emma looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change. Slowly, she returned the salute. Then the moment ended. The officer lowered his hand and stepped forward. Ma'am, he said respectfully. We received confirmation of the neurological response. Emma nodded slightly. He is stabilizing. The officer glanced through the ICU window toward the bed. The Marine general's son continued breathing steadily, each breath stronger than the last. Because of you, the officer said quietly. Behind him, the hospital director stepped forward again. Doctor, Whitaker's voice was tense now. This hospital cannot allow military personnel to conduct operations here. The officer turned his head slowly. Director Whitaker, correct? Yes. Whitaker straightened slightly, regaining some confidence. You cannot interfere with hospital administration. The officer looked at him calmly. Let me clarify something. He gestured toward Emma. That woman saved the life of a Marine officer's son. Whitaker crossed his arms. Why violating protocol? The officer stepped closer. His voice dropped to a quiet, controlled tone. Director, do you understand who you removed from that ICU? Whitaker said nothing. The officer continued. Matt Carter served as the lead medical specialist for Joint Special Operations Task Force units in multiple theaters. Afghanistan, Iraq, Eastern Europe. Dozens of high-risk combat extractions. He paused. She has personally kept more Tier 1 operators alive than most battlefield surgeons ever will. The doctors nearby exchanged stunned looks. Doctor, Bennett spoke quietly. She mentioned Afghanistan. The officer nodded. Yes. He looked back at Whitaker. And tonight she saved another life. Whitaker's confidence had clearly weakened. But he tried to maintain control. This is still a hospital. And she still violated medical policy. The officer studied him for a moment. Then he spoke again. Director, 30 minutes ago, your hospital had a patient declared brain dead. Whitaker didn't answer. Now that patient is breathing on his own. Silence. The officer continued. Because one nurse refused to give up. The Marine general stepped out of the ICU room. The Marines guarding the door immediately stepped aside. General Hale walked slowly toward Emma. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, he simply studied her. Then the Marine General, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Corps, did something that shocked everyone in the hallway. He extended his hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. And Matt shook it. "You're welcome, sir." The general glanced toward the ICU. "My son is alive because you reminded him how to fight." Emma shook her head slightly. "He did the fighting." The general smiled faintly. "Marines always do." Behind them, the hospital director stood silently. The reality of the situation had finally settled over him. The woman he had publicly removed from the ICU was the very reason the hospital now had a living patient instead of a death report. "Dr. Bennett stepped forward. Director, we need her expertise." Whitaker didn't respond. But the neurologist continued. "Her technique triggered the neurological recovery." The officer folded his arms. "And if that recovery continues, this case will become one of the most important neurological recoveries ever documented." The words landed heavily. Whitaker finally spoke. His voice was quieter now. "Nurse Carter." Emma looked at him. "You are cleared to return to the ICU." There was no apology. Just reluctant permission. But Emma didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked toward the room where the boy continued breathing. Then she shook her head slightly. "The doctors have it under control now." Whitaker frowned. "You're refusing?" Emma answered calmly. "I was only needed to start the fight." She glanced toward the neurologists. "They know how to finish it." The Marine General watched her carefully. "You're leaving?" Emma nodded. "There are other patients in the hospital." Her tone carried no pride, no resentment, just quiet simplicity. Saving lives had never been about recognition. It had always been about showing up when someone needed help. The SEAL officer spoke again. "Ma'am, command would like to speak with you." Emma smiled faintly. "They always do." Then she turned and began walking down the hallway. No dramatic exit. No speeches. Just the quiet steps of someone returning to work. Behind her, the hospital staff watched silently. Because every one of them now understood something they hadn't seen before. The quiet nurse they had underestimated had been a battlefield legend long before she ever stepped into their hospital. Inside the ICU, the Marine General returned to his son's bedside. The boy's breathing continued to strengthen. Life was returning. And somewhere down the hallway, Emma Carter was already checking on another patient. Because heroes rarely stay where applause is waiting. They go where they're needed next. And sometimes, the most extraordinary person in the room is the one no one noticed until it mattered most. If this story moved you, remember something important. Real strength doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears a simple nurse's uniform. So if you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and comment what you would have done.